General, I'm afraid we've been having a little trouble about your broadcast.
Well, I'm used to trouble. I'm a soldier.
Yes, the authorities think that it's a little ill-timed and might be better postponed.
Think it's a little ill-timed? Who has been saying that? Why?
The British way of censoring things is to look at something and say, well, I don't know whether it's really in the national interest if the public should know this. What they mean is whether it's in our interest, whether it's in the government interest, whether it's in the civil service interest. And if there's any doubt, cut it out.
I've been serving my country for 44 years. What was your position before this one, sir, eh? What?
A lawyer.
A lawyer? Well, I was a soldier. And before that, I suppose you were at college, and I was a soldier. And I was a soldier when you were a baby. And before you were born, sir, when you were nothing but a toss-up between a girl's and a boy's name, I was a soldier then. I'm deeply sorry, sir. I know it's not you.
No, I'm afraid it isn't.
It may have to do with our potty training, but I don't think so. I think it has to do with our institutions, with our feeling that we also owe a duty back to the protecting, enveloping, safeguarding, ruling elite, that they can't be expected to conduct their business in public, that they give up so much in order to run things that the least they're entitled to is a bit of privacy, discretion. And this instinct in ourselves is quite, I think, deeply rooted. After all, we want to trust them. If half of what we suspect about them was true, we'd have to panic.
That's only half the story. When do I get the other half? On the back burner, I understand. Well, as you know, I am the soul of discretion.
Britain is probably the most secret of all the Western democracies. Secrecy becomes an end in itself. The idea of disclosure becomes an anathema.
Well, I think there are always leaks. There was certainly a great deal of leaking during the period of the Labour government because I was an opposition spokesman and I was rather dependent on it. And some people have been disaffected and have decided to leak information, which of course I deplore. I think it's very wrong to do so.
I'm concerned about leaks, whatever their numbers. I think that they date back far before the recent period. Statistically, I think it would be hard to prove that they have increased in number. I think that they've increased in visibility.
The problem is I'm not only restricted by the Official Secrets Act, but I'm also injuncted against saying anything to you. And much as I'd like to be able to describe these things, I'm not at present able to.
The real law was put in place in 1911. And there had been at that time a massive scare about German spies who were supposed to be sort of wandering Britain, investigating all sorts of high-secret technologies and so on. And the government felt compelled to rush through the House of Commons and the House of Lords a piece of legislation to counter this imminent threat of German espionage. And the result of that rushed legislation was the Official Secrets Act 1911. So rushed, in fact, that it went through both houses in a matter of hours, and it was regarded as profoundly traitorous for any member of the House to question the bona fides of this legislation.
Official censorship wasn't necessary during World War I because newspapers did the job themselves. The British press cheered the troops on their way to the slaughterhouse and lied vigorously for king and country.
In the First World War, there must have been more deliberate lies told than any other period in history. From the very beginning, the whole attitude of the British government was to demonize the Germans, to coin epithets that made them appear subhuman monsters. Hun, Bosch, Kaiser Bill, the whole story of the rape of Belgium, the stories about the cutting off of nuns' breasts, the rape of women and children, bayoneting of babies, all of course turned out at the end to be absolutely false. Now, before the First World War, the British public believed implicitly in what it read in newspapers. Bets were settled by, is it in the paper? If it's in the paper, it must be true. Papers were regarded on much the same level of truthfulness as encyclopedias. Now, for the first time ever in the First World War, all those Tommies in France suffering in the trenches had a chance to compare the reality of what they knew to be true with what their relatives and friends were reading back home in the newspapers. And the difference was so enormous that it meant, for that moment onwards, the average Englishman lost faith in the press. And attacks across no man's land, which resulted in 40, 50, 60% casualties, were reported as if the whole thing was a great game in which the British Tommy couldn't get enough. Now, the other way that British war correspondents distorted the real view of what was happening in the First World War was to simply lie about what had occurred. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 must have been one of the greatest disasters in British military history, a very bloody, disastrous battle. Yet the war correspondents who were present at the time used phrases like a good day for Britain and France, a hopeful beginning to the end of the war, sort of thing. Now, they justified this later by saying that they were reporting what was supposed to have happened rather than what really happened.
There were no newspapers during the 1926 general strike, so the government created its own source of propaganda, a broadsheet called the British Gazette. As a means of appealing to the sense of national order, the new radio medium came into its own. The first prime ministerial broadcasts consisted of appeals for an end to the class war.
This is London calling on all stations. The Right Honourable Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister.
The Trade Union Council has decreed that the railways shall not run, the transport shall not move, that the unloading of ships shall stop, and that no news shall reach the public.
Suddenly I had qualms about the word dignity that I'd written in his speech. A stupid word to use. This was no time to stand on dignity.
Without reserve. That is the government position. To continue the struggle can only increase disaster and misery the longer it lasts.
I crossed out dignity and wrote safety and security instead.
The trade union leaders are willing to abandon the general strike.
The BBC, in my view, had no real freedom from the government during the general strike. Firstly, because during the general strike, the BBC, as we now know it, hadn't been created. That's to say, the Royal Charter, although it had been drafted, was not yet in operation. And Reith knew that if he stepped out of line a millimetre, the government would probably withdraw that and have different plans for broadcasting, which, to his credit, he thought would have been less free than what he had negotiated for the BBC Charter. Secondly, he knew that there was a strong faction in the cabinet led by Churchill who wished to simply take the BBC over and make it a state broadcasting organisation, at least for the duration of the strike.
I intend to warn the working man of the inevitable misery, which will be the lot of all those who participate in this monstrous strike, and to advertise the British Gazette, which I shall personally publish tomorrow. What is your objection to that?
Nothing, except that most people trust the BBC to speak the truth.
I don't propose to lie.
I do not think they treated me fairly, John Reith moaned in his diary. They will not say we are controlled, and they make me take the onus of turning people down. But he did what the government wanted, becoming the BBC's own censor.
Reith cleared directly with the cabinet and Baldwin all the key statements made about the general strike. No strike representative was allowed on the air. The Archbishop of Canterbury Temple, who was in favour of mediation and had some sympathy with the strikers at least, was also not allowed on the air. So I don't think there's much historical question that the BBC had no real freedom in the coverage of the general strike.
The British Empire faces an extraordinary crisis. Not for centuries have these Houses of Parliament witnessed so dangerous a political struggle. Shall King Edward VIII marry Mrs. Simpson? No, say the ministers of the cabinet supported by the Church of England and the upper classes. They are bitter in opposition to the king marrying the American woman twice divorced. The lady from Baltimore, who married first a United States naval lieutenant and then a wealthy Londoner. Now the most publicized woman on earth. The fate of empire, the destiny of monarchy, rests with the will of this young man.
Silence about the King and Mrs. Simpson was maintained after Edward VIII asked newspaper proprietors for discretion in the coverage of his private life. The London political class knew exactly what was going on. Elsewhere, a blanket of euphemism smothered the affair. Offending questions were struck from the parliamentary record. When the crisis became public knowledge, it was depicted in newsreels as a grave chapter in the long history of empire. Britain had overcome mortal danger and stood triumphant.
December the 10th, 1936, one of the most momentous days in the history of England. On this day, the decision of King Edward VIII was awaited with anxiety throughout the empire. The hands of Big Ben approached the hour of climax, and our thoughts went out to Queen Mary, the King's mother.
This is Windsor Castle. His Royal Highness Prince Edward.
A few hours ago, I discharged my last duty as King and Emperor. And now that I have been succeeded by my brother, the Duke of York, my first words must be to declare my allegiance to him. God bless you all. God save the King.
Throughout the 1930s, the BBC, with its national monopoly of broadcasting, was seen as a great institution, representing the nation to itself across traditional British divides of class and politics. The reality was somewhat different.
There were certain no-go areas which the government policed very rigorously. There was a famous series of supposedly educational programs which went very well for the first 5, which were for about general kind of what we would now call civics. But when they got onto things like unemployment, the Foreign Office simply banned them. Not only did the Foreign Office ban them, but they did not allow the BBC to say that they had been banned, which is supposedly their right under the Charter. And from that moment onwards, the BBC was running scared, and they were particularly running scared in the area of foreign affairs, which was policed most closely.
At Nuremberg, the scene of the Nazi Congress, Hitler and Henlein fill the picture.
Appeasing Hitler became the goal of British foreign policy, pursued with single-mindedness, if not vigor. Discreetly, the Foreign Office made sure that British newsreels reflected its own worldview. Interviews with those who believed Britain should stand up to fascism were cut.
What these activities spell, time alone will show. But we all sincerely hope that the outcome will be peace.
This policy is not a policy that will lead to peace. It will not lead to a settlement of the affairs of Europe. It is essentially a war policy, and it aligns this country with the reactionary forces of the world. The repercussions of this event will be widespread in the dominions, in the colonies, and throughout the world. It is most noticeable that everywhere the enemies of peace and democracy are rejoicing. The friends of this country are depressed.
Now who's rank? Quite a number of...
Churchill accused the BBC of muzzling him. The BBC conceded that scripts were vetted by the Foreign Office, but said lamely that this was done as a matter of courtesy.
If I'm good.
I was given complete freedom in writing to talk of an...
At the request of the Foreign Office, former editor of the Times, Wickham Steed, was snipped out of the American-owned Paramount newsreel at the say-so of the American ambassador, Joseph Kennedy. Later, when he alluded in public to this act of censorship, he was snipped again.
At their request, I made a few remarks that I thought apposite to the occasion. Not all of them appeared in the version of the film that was shown, but one remark did appear and was promptly suppressed. It was this:
I hope it will not now lead to the suppression of this film if one is being taken. Does Hitler want war? Oh, no. He only wants to get, without fighting, more than he would be likely to get by fighting. And we are helping him to get it.
And the Prime Minister comes home. Home to an empire filled with joy and relief. Home to a welcome that he will never forget.
When Neville Chamberlain happily sacrificed Czechoslovakia to Hitler's ambitions, the British media led the cheering.
This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine.
It's the greatest diplomatic triumph of modern time.
We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
Let no man criticize the bargain that the statesmen of Britain and France have struck until he has attempted to add up the total price that might have had to be paid for any other settlement, a price in death and destruction. That price will not be paid. There will be peace.
Fighting Hitler in the century of total war required the mobilization of British opinion. Yet the government maintained that there was no censorship. Newspapers could say whatever they wished, even to the degree of criticizing war conduct. In reality, press and public opinion was ceaselessly molded by the Ministry of Information, a bureaucracy employing over 1,000 people, with morale raising its function. With the example of the First World War in mind, and to differentiate their activities from those of the enemy, the bureaucrats referred to their work as propaganda by means of truth.
It became much more difficult to impose the same sort of total censorship as existed in World War I. And we can see the beginnings in the Second World War of appealing to the press, the media, the filmmakers, to get on side, as a phrase later used in Vietnam. And the way this was done was to say, look, we're fighting a war of national survival. Therefore, we feel the duty of the media is to do everything possible to help us win that war. Now, there was some truth in this, of course. It was a war of national survival, and everybody wanted Britain to win, wanted democracy to win. So anything that the journalists could do to help towards that was justified.
As an American war correspondent in this country, I send every week to my readers in the United States a dispatch about how you people all over Britain are fighting the war for democracy. These men and women who have worked all day in offices or in markets are now hurrying home to change into the uniform of their particular service. The dusk is deepening. Listening crews are posted all the way from
The manipulation of news was sophisticated and cleverly adjusted to the British self-image of quiet heroism. Within the limits created by the perceived needs to stiffen resistance by raising morale, British propaganda did often tell the truth.
A few people, probably some of the people you are watching now. Now they're going into the public shelters. This is not a pleasant way to spend the night, but the people accept it as their part in the defense of London.
But there was a less attractive side to British propaganda. Not Big Brother exactly, but nagging, an endless smugness and a dreary mission to uplift.
The people of Britain aren't like Nazi robots. They're interested in everything, from carriages to kings. In books about gardening, technical training, economics and heroes, and statesmen. The day-to-day history of our democracy is officially recorded in Hansard. But now in the midst of war, anyone can buy selections of the reports for sixpence.
Now, I think if you're running a democracy, it's very important that people know what's going on so that they can make informed decisions about matters of vital importance to them. And yet the attitude of the British government was, we'll tell you only what we think we want you to know.
Everyone was required to do his or her bit. Whether they liked it or not, intellectuals such as George Orwell became part of the war effort.
I am now definitely an employee of the BBC.
He had a pretty dry sense of humour, and you could see him sort of sitting, watching everything going on.
Its atmosphere is something halfway between a girls' school and a lunatic asylum. And all we're doing at present is useless, or slightly worse than useless. Nevertheless, one rapidly becomes propaganda-minded and develops a cunning one did not previously have.
Well, there was a lot of censorship, and everything that was broadcast had to be censored for security and policy.
The tendency of the modern state is to wipe out the freedom of the intellect. The modern state needs, for example, pamphlet writers, poster artists, illustrators, broadcasters, lecturers, film producers, actors, and whatnot. The British government started the present war with a more or less openly declared intention of keeping the literary intelligentsia out of it. Yet, after 3 years of war, almost every writer, however undesirable his political history or opinions, has been sucked into the various ministries, or the BBC.
The BBC and the Ministry of Information later became Orwell's Ministry of Truth.
Well, I think he thought that you could use propaganda machines to invent anything, to make people make speeches they hadn't ever made. He certainly thought that propaganda machines are propaganda machines, and he didn't like being part of one. On the other hand, he accepted that a war required all this apparatus.
Germans were never demonized as they had been during World War I. Instead, they were rendered ridiculous. But censorship led to the suppression of important truth. Although the BBC was made aware early on of the extermination of European Jews, its reports usually referred to Jewish deportations. At the request of the Foreign Office, accusations of genocide were cut from newsreels and broadcasts.
Extermination of Jews is a definite policy of Germany being carried out now. According to official reports in the hands of my government, more than 1/3 of the Polish Jews out of a total of 3,130,000 have already been exterminated.
During the First War, all sorts of stories were put out. And we believed them, we used them in propaganda, and then they were completely untrue, and that propaganda, I say, rebounded on us.
British officials did not believe in the Holocaust. Poles, and even more so Jews, were busy stoking up Allied public opinion. They should be treated with caution.
They had perhaps stronger feelings, far stronger feelings than the Poles, and they had, and I think Jewish people have a vivid imagination, a vivid imagination. I mean, I was wrong, yes, I admit it, but one has to try and be skeptical and balanced.
Nothing had prepared the British soldiers who arrived in Belsen at the end of the war for what they saw. To them and to the British public, the horror was not believable.
The things in this camp are beyond describing. When you actually see them for yourselves, you know what you're fighting for here. Pictures in the paper cannot describe it at all.
This morning we buried over 5,000 bodies. We don't know who they are. Behind me you can see a pit which will contain another 5,000. There are 2 others like it in preparation. All these deaths have been caused by systematic starvation and typhus and disease, which have been spread because of the treatment meted out to these poor people by their SS guards and their SS chief.
A British film about Belsen, made under Alfred Hitchcock's guidance, was ultimately judged too upsetting to be shown and never completed. At the end of the most atrocious war in history, taste was given as a reason for not showing the worst, as it would be with respect to other atrocious wars and other famines. Even in peacetime, as they were clearing their desks, the censors knew best. Big powers required nuclear weapons. Socialist Britain, which hoped to fight the Cold War, began to develop its arsenal in early 1947. As the media pondered the merits of atoms or rejoiced in their awesome power, a secrecy so complete enveloped Britain's efforts that all but a handful of cabinet ministers were kept in the dark.
The Cold War and the atomic program both began so soon after the war that really many people just continued, as it were, in a war mode, working in the sort of way that they had done in munitions factories and ROFs during the war, making do, cutting corners, working themselves and their equipment absolutely to destruction, anything to meet the requirements of the defence programme without question. They never questioned it. If it was said to be needed and said to be urgent and it was for defence, they did it at absolutely all costs. I think that was quite understandable. There was a great sense of pride in what Britain had done in the atomic energy program during the war and in the contribution that scientists had made. I think there was another reason that Britain, after all, was still a great power.
After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the horror of atomic weapons was so great that all governments, of course, felt very reluctant about discussing atomic weapons because of the public reaction. One of the major things that happened that, of course, brought or tended to bring not only atomic bombs but atomic power into disrepute was the fire at Windscale. It happened to be in one of the reactors, which had been mainly for weapons production. And the government did have some degree of cover-up about the extent of the radioactivity that was being released at that time.
Windscale, situated on a beautiful but populated stretch of Cumbrian coastline, caught fire in October 1957.
The works manager rang me up and said there's a site emergency. They're having trouble at Windscale and that it would be prudent to stay indoors and close the windows and so forth. That was at 4 o'clock, I remember quite clearly, on the Thursday. And yet, on the other side of the fence, absolutely nothing was done.
So that members of the public were walking around unaware of the fire?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
While workers were staying indoors?
Yes.
A soothing account of the Windscale mishap, referring to overheating, was given to the unsuspecting public. According to this official version, the radioactive material, which had not been released in dangerous quantities, was blowing harmlessly out to sea.
The Atomic Energy Authority have announced that some uranium cartridges in the center of the atomic pilot Windscale became overheated yesterday. The authority have said that staff are now reducing the temperature of the pile with water. At the moment, a northeast wind is blowing across the Windscale factory and is taking any radioactive dust or vapor out to sea.
It was obvious that it hadn't blown out to sea, that quite a lot of it was in the coastal strip. It was highly unsatisfactory that the authority should be able to hush these things up when there was obviously something radically wrong. So I wrote to The Guardian.
By the 1980s, it was estimated that over 30 people had died and 247 had developed thyroid cancer as a consequence of the accident. A report had been commissioned at the time, but it was suppressed. What do we do? Not very difficult, wrote Prime Minister Macmillan on the report. What do we say? Not easy. It was least difficult to say nothing. There was a lot of saying nothing in the 1950s. A tame press was kept in line by means of D notices. These pieces of paper told the media what the government would like left unmentioned.
The government, and it wouldn't have mattered whether it was Labour or Tory, they'd both done the same, decided that they want to continue the arrangement whereby they had some control, some degree of censorship of the press.
D notices go to the editors of most of the
media, whether it's written or spoken or visual, as general guidance.
Requesting that such and such a tank or such and such a plane or such and such an incident should not be mentioned.
The denotice system has actually worked, in my view, remarkably well because it's been extraordinarily free, for the most part, of political interference. The system would collapse absolutely if politicians of whatever party tried to abuse it.
Front page news throughout Europe was the dramatic disappearance of Mrs. Maclean, wife of the British diplomat, who vanished in similar circumstances 2 years ago.
Stories, like Wives of Diplomats, were in the habit of vanishing just as they began to get interesting.
A clever government has ways of releasing information in dribs and drabs so they can always say later on, well, we told the public about that right from the very beginning. I mean, take the Burgess and Maclean story. It was reported as 2 vanishing British diplomats. No mention was ever made early on about the fact that Maclean had access to atomic secrets and that Burgess had been a former member of the British Secret Intelligence Service. It was said they'd vanished. Everybody knew within 24 hours, everybody in the know knew within 24 hours they'd gone to the Soviet Union. The poor old ignorant John Public in Britain had to wait years in order to get this information.
Commander Crabbe's name has jumped into the news since the Soviet cruiser Ordzhonikidze came to Portsmouth Harbour, bringing Bulgarin and Khrushchev on their visit to Britain.
There were a number of instances where the denotice secretary, for example, had clearly been ordered to give no assistance whatever to the media. And one that I remember in particular was the case involving Commander Crabbe.
During the Ordzhonikidze's visit, her captain reported a frogman had been seen alongside. The British Navy denied it. But 11 days later, the British press were talking about Commander Crabbe. He was missing, reported killed, while testing new underwater equipment.
And he disappeared. This man had certainly died, as it turned out, while doing this exercise. Some believe that he had actually been killed by the Russians, by Russian frogmen while doing it. And of course it was the political embarrassment that should be the ship that had brought these 2 men on a goodwill mission to Britain that made it so terrifying for the government. Well, the government, the denotice secretary was told, don't help them in any way, refer everything to the Admiralty. And the Admiralty had been instructed or decided to do it on its own bat, simply to lie about it.
Mr. Philby, Mr. Macmillan, the Foreign Secretary, said there was no evidence that you were the so-called third man who allegedly tipped off Burgess and Maclean. Are you satisfied with that clearance that he gave you?
Yes, I am.
Were you, in fact, the third man?
No, I was not.
Do you think there was one?
No comment.
Philby himself defected. Vanishing British diplomat story all over again. Disappears from Beirut. Where's he gone? Nobody knew until some time later, when it was no longer important, because it was no longer news, that Philby was in British intelligence, that he'd been head of the anti-Soviet section of British intelligence, and that he'd gone to Moscow. It wasn't reported that he was in Moscow until a year later. And yet, of course, British intelligence knew within 24 hours where he'd gone.
Well, Mr. Philby, the disappearance of Burgess and Maclean is almost as much of a mystery today as it was when they went away about 4 years ago or more. Can you shed any light on it at all?
No, I can't. In the first place, I'm debarred by the Official Secrets Act from saying anything that might disclose to unauthorized persons information derived from my position as a former government official.
A Viking aircraft of the Queen's flight touches down at RAF Station Aldergrove, bringing Her Majesty the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh on a visit to Northern Ireland. The Governor, Lord Wakehurst, welcomes the royal couple on behalf of the people.
For a long time, Northern Ireland was a self-censored story. I mean, the people who now say it should be more censored forget that in the long run-up to the crisis that broke out in 68, 69, there was no full-time reporter from any national newspaper in Northern Ireland. The broadcasting media never visited the place, and there was a Special Powers Act which could cope with any delinquency on the part of the press on the very rare occasions when there was any.
Northern Ireland was represented to the British people as a very pleasant place, with sort of the Fermanagh Lakeland there, and a country which was being run by a one-party government with a Protestant ethos, but it seemed to work. So why worry about these sort of disgruntled or truculent Catholics who were arguing for civil rights? Didn't really matter very much, did it?
As the killing went on, efforts on the part of British journalists to understand the dirty wars of Northern Ireland became less welcome. Television reporting, dominated by images of violence and, in the views of the authorities, most easily manipulated, was placed at risk. In the 1970s and 80s, over 50 television programs were banned, delayed, or tampered with. Nothing was ever forbidden, but not everything was permitted.
Too often what is being banned is the uncomfortable truth. We're at war in Northern Ireland, but we're not at war. We like to represent the situation there as being a straightforward military situation, but it obviously isn't. And I think the fact that the troubles have continued for so long is a source of real embarrassment. Governments from time to time have specific initiatives in Northern Ireland, and then they're very unhappy about any information or reporting which hampers, as they would say, their initiatives.
A target of British censorship was the IRA. Republican violence, but Republican rhetoric too, was deemed offensive. Placing the IRA beyond a new electronic pale was a way of criminalizing the opponent.
Not a day passes without some of our people in the north being shot, gassed, arrested or maltreated in some way or another. And the brutal murder of 2 brave Irish women in Belfast early yesterday morning, the terrible tragedy, the killing of 3 young men in Newry last night, must bring home to our people just what British rule means to our people in the north.
When British troops fired on a Derry crowd in 1972, television showed an interview with a former paratrooper who saw what happened, but recorded interviews with Irish marchers were not shown.
The troops immediately got out of their armoured cars, followed by about 100 paratroopers, which I recognize from their red berets and know them very well. And they immediately got down into firing positions and fired indiscriminately into the fleeing crowd who were running past my house. I actually saw them firing from the flats over there, and I saw 3 bodies fall, and they grabbed the bodies like sheep, dead sheep, and that's all one can describe it as, and chucked them, threw them into the back of the armoured car.
I think a lot of people would argue in the broadcasting organizations the important thing is not to give offense to the viewer, and if we can avoid it, not have a row with government. But sometimes it's necessary to give offense because what's more important than giving of offense is telling the truth.
Whether British journalists liked it or not, television reporting became yet another weapon of the dirty war. IRA propagandists staged events for the benefit of news crews, and when these were banned, pointed to British censorship as evidence of the reality of British oppression.
I think one of the things which has been lost to British public opinion is really the dirty war itself, the way in which democracy, our democratic values have been compromised. I think journalism has become too reflex. There's also a tiredness about it, a failure to sort of say, look, I mean, there are things which should be investigated here. The public does have a right to know. I mean, I remember a colleague of mine, a journalistic colleague, saying to me, the public doesn't need to know that. I think that's frightening. I think it's important that the conflict is constantly examined to find out why it's there. Because only by finding out that is there a way out of it.
Man is born free. That is his natural state, his God-given right.
In the 1980s, ruling British doctrine was preoccupied with sovereignty and economic self-interest. Other forms of liberty were of no great concern.
Facing the mightiest armies of the world to defend our freedom. Sometimes at tremendous sacrifice.
Let me give you my vision. A man's right to work as he will, to spend what he earns, to own property, to have the state as servant and not as master. These are the British inheritance.
Margaret Thatcher's contribution to the British tradition of freedom of speech was to show us, with her usual and admirable clarity, the extent to which the system in this country could be turned to the advantage of a single, determined, ideologically driven leader.
Among disgruntled civil servants, leaking documents acquired the status of a vocation.
A leak is a deliberate betrayal of a specific piece of information.
Leakers were high-minded and progressive, motivated by the urgings of their conscience.
There was nowhere else to take it. The Guardian is really the only left-of-centre, middle-of-the-road type sort of newspaper that comes out of Fleet Street that has national coverage. I felt that it was immoral and that a Secretary of State for Defence who was accountable to Parliament had decided he wasn't going to be accountable to Parliament on that particular day, the day that the cruise missiles arrived. He was going to wait until after they were here, and at the end of his allotted question time, tell the House that they were here, and then get up and leave before the opposition had time to react in the House. I took it round on the evening of the 21st of October, and I was aware that there was a big CND march planned for the next morning.
The leaker of leakers was Clive Ponting, a successful and ambitious civil servant at the Ministry of Defence. Given the task of answering MPs' questions about the sinking by a submarine of the Argentine battleship General Belgrano during the Falklands War, Ponting discovered that the government had been telling lies. So he leaked the true story to Parliament.
Everything that the government had said for the previous 2 years was not in fact correct. We discovered that, in fact, the Belgrano had been sailing away from the task force for 11 hours before it had been sunk. It hadn't been detected on the day the government said, but had been trailed for nearly 2 days before it had been sunk, that no public warning had been issued.
The Clive Ponting prosecution was unsuccessful. The judge did what the judge was expected to do and directed the jury to equate the interests of the nation with the interests of the government of the day. But the jury had none of it and acquitted him. And the government therefore found that official secrets legislation was suddenly an uncertain weapon with which to punish those who communicated information which was in breach of their duty within the civil service. After that, and throughout the entire Spycatcher affair and the countless additional injunctions that were emerging during that period, one saw a change of emphasis towards the use of the breach of confidence jurisdiction.
Those bastards will never give up.
Alleging that his memoirs were in breach of confidence, the government pursued Peter Wright all the way to Australia. The pursuit turned into a contest of strength between the former Spycatcher and his British masters, who wanted his secrets kept.
Well, we've been fighting this for more than 2 years, since October 1985. It's been a very long, protracted and wearisome battle.
Humiliation awaited these British efforts. Australian judges could not understand why a government should have the power to place free speech at jeopardy in the name of governmental secrecy.
The High Court could still stop Spycatcher, though. The next British appeal goes to the court just 5 days before the book is scheduled to be released.
Well, we're very happy, and I'm only sorry that Peter's not here to see this result. It seems to be a complete victory, Mr. Turnbull. Well, yes, it is. Yes, well, it is. Yes, we've won.
May I tell you that if we appeal, the case is not yet over.
We shall appeal, but we have first to read the judgment and to get advice.
It's been described as a diabolical mess. What do you say to that?
No, it's not a diabolical mess. There's a very, very clear principle involved.
If you are employed by somebody, you owe a duty of loyalty to your employer, whether it's in government or in commerce or business or wherever it may be. And it's certainly not your duty to leak or give away confidential information, whether it's political or whether it's commercial.
The principle of free speech was further tested when the BBC wished to show a film about the extremes of opinion in Northern Ireland. Should the British be allowed to hear these views? Were there circumstances in which political opinion was not acceptable?
Martin McGuinness. And the man is a craven coward because he's the same as the IRA murderers.
Asked by the Home Secretary to ban the programme, BBC governors obliged, though they later changed their minds. Unconvincingly, Home Secretary Leon Britton protested that he had not been acting as a censor.
If the BBC had decided to put that programme on, they would have gone ahead, and that would have been it. I wouldn't have dreamt of using any residual powers that I have. Wouldn't have thought of it for a single moment.
The terror continued. Exasperated, responding to public pressures, the British government imposed a ban on the spokesmen of Sinn Féin, the political wing of the IRA. They could be seen on television, but they must never be heard speaking in their own voices.
Some of these measures do restrict freedom, but those who choose to live by the bomb and the gun, and those who support them, can't in all circumstances be accorded exactly the same rights as everyone else.
Journalists were obliged to find ways of working within the strict terms of the ban. Reminding them of their responsibilities, Adams saluted them as freedom fighters.
As I remind them of their responsibilities, I salute them as freedom fighters.
The Sinn Féin ban has clearly reduced the numbers of appearances of Sinn Féin and other paramilitaries. It has enabled Sinn Féin to hold its annual conference, its Ardèche, with a big banner in front of it which says censored. And it allows Sinn Féin to argue, as it has for a long time, to the people in Northern Ireland and elsewhere, that the only reason why the working classes of both Ireland and the United Kingdom aren't united in support of Sinn Féin is because the message is censored and so on.
A new Official Secrets Act in 1989 purported to liberalise existing legislation while making it more coherent. Critics believed it meant more of the same.
If I were a Martian drifting into Britain, I would first of all be utterly staggered that it described itself as a democracy, and would need a great deal of instruction as to why it was.
I don't believe that the present form taken by the monopoly of power and information by the civil service, or the ability to short-circuit Parliament, could be sustained if there was a Freedom of Information Act.
We have no Freedom of Information Act. We have no Bill of Rights. What we do have is an Official Secrets Act which says there's no public interest defense, there's no prior publication defense, so the rest of the world can read something, but you and I, oh no, we mustn't be allowed to read it. So I think an already secret society, which is what we are, has become more secret.
Big brother! 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 Big brother!
Attention! A later bulletin has just been issued by the Ministry of Peace. The southward advance of the Eurasian army on the African front is still continuing. It is feared that unless a counterattack is launched immediately, the whole of Central Africa may fall to the invading hordes. A defeat in this area might well threaten the very heart of Oceania itself. In this grave crisis, the Ministry of Truth will continue to issue frequent bulletins.